The janitor was mopping the gymnasium floor when the military dog broke formation, walked straight past 3 armed handlers, and sat down in front of him like he was reporting for duty. Nobody in that room could explain it, least of all the janitor, who dropped his mop and started to shake. The overhead lights in the Route 9 High School gymnasium in Millbrook, Pennsylvania buzzed with a dull, tired hum, the kind that only exists in old buildings that have seen too many pep rallies and not enough repairs. Folding chairs had been set out in neat rows for the town's Veterans Day assembly, and the bleachers were packed with students in matching maroon hoodies, phones half raised, mostly bored, the way teenagers usually are until something happens that they can't look away from. At the front of the gym stood a folding table covered in a blue cloth, and on it sat a small collection of items nobody paid much attention to, yet a folded flag, a framed photograph, and a dog's old leather collar, cracked with age, laid out like relics nobody had bothered to explain. Behind the table, in dress uniform, stood a decorated Marine Corps colonel named Robert Hale, there to present the school's annual Hometown Hero Award. Beside him, on a short lead, sat a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois named Duke, sleek and dark, his chest marked with a K9 unit patch. Duke belonged to the county sheriff's department now, on loan for the ceremony. Because somebody in the front office thought a working police dog would make good theater for the kids. Nobody expected Duke to do anything except sit still and look impressive for the cameras. At the back of the gymnasium, near the double doors, a man in grey coveralls pushed a rolling mop bucket across the floor, working the far corner where the bleachers cast a long shadow. He was maybe 60, grey-bearded, quiet, the kind of man whose name most people in the building didn't know, even though he'd worked there for 6 years. The students called him Mr. Walt. Teachers waved at him in the hallway without slowing down. He kept his head low and his eyes on the floor, the way men do when they've learned that being invisible is safer than being seen. He wasn't supposed to be working during the assembly. He'd asked the vice principal for the shift on purpose, actually, because ceremonies made his chest go tight in ways he'd never learned to explain to anyone, and the corner by the doors was as far from the folding chairs as the building allowed. Colonel Hale was midway through the honoree's biography, a local National Guard sergeant who'd helped with flood relief the previous spring. When Duke's ears snapped forward, the dog went rigid. His nose lifted into the air, and a low sound rolled out of his chest. Not a growl, something else, something the deputy holding his leash had never heard from him before. Not once in 3 years of night patrols and drug searches and every kind of chaos a small-town K9 unit runs into. Duke took 1 step forward, then another. The leash pulled taut. "Duke, heel," the deputy whispered, tugging gently. Duke did not heel. The dog's eyes had locked onto something at the back of the room. His whole body had gone still in that terrified, focused way military and police dogs go still right before they move. And every person who had ever handled a working K9 in that gymnasium felt their pulse spike at once. Even the kids in the front row, who understood nothing about dog behavior, understood on some primal level that something had shifted in the air. "Sir, hold up," the deputy said to the colonel, but it was too late. The leash slipped. Or maybe the deputy let it slip because he sensed, on some animal level of his own, that stopping the dog would have been wrong. Duke moved. He didn't run. He didn't lunge. He walked, deliberate, controlled, the way a soldier walks across a parade ground, straight down the center aisle between the folding chairs while 300 students turned to watch in dead silence. He walked past the bleachers, past the folding table, past Colonel Hale himself, past the flag and the photograph and the cracked leather collar nobody had bothered to explain, until he reached the back of the gym where the janitor stood frozen, with his mop handle gripped in both hands. Duke stopped in front of him. And then the Belgian Malinois, a dog trained to detect explosives, subdue armed suspects, and never, under any circumstances, break protocol during a public ceremony, lowered his front legs to the floor in a slow, deliberate bow, and then sat bolt upright at perfect attention, staring up at the janitor's face. Somebody in the bleachers gasped. A phone camera clicked. The gym fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the ceiling lights seemed to grow louder, filling the space where 300 held breaths should have been. The janitor did not move. His hands were shaking so badly the mop handle rattled against the bucket, a small metallic sound that carried farther than it should have in that stunned silence. "That's not normal," the deputy holding the leash muttered, jogging down the aisle, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. "Duke's never done that. Not once. Not in 3 years." Colonel Hale set down his note cards. He was a man who had commanded Marines under fire in Fallujah, who did not startle easily, but something about the way that dog was staring up at the janitor made the hair on his arms stand up. The same instinct that had once told him a quiet street was about to turn into an ambush. "Sir," the colonel called out, his voice carrying across the gym, pitched to reach the back wall without shouting. "What's your name?" The janitor looked up slowly. His eyes were wet, and something in his face had changed in the last 30 seconds. The careful blankness he wore like armor had cracked straight down the middle. "Walter," he said, barely audible. "Walter Combs." Duke, still sitting at perfect attention, lifted one paw and set it gently against the man's boot. A girl in the second row of bleachers, maybe 15 years old, whispered to her friend, "Is that dog crying?" And nobody laughed at her for asking, because it did look that way, the faint whine building low in the animal's throat, a sound none of the students had words for, but every adult in the room recognized instantly as grief finally being allowed to surface. Nobody in that gymnasium understood what they had just witnessed, but every single person there, students, teachers, the colonel, the deputy, felt the same cold certainty settle over them. This was not a coincidence. This dog knew this man, and nobody in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had any idea who Walter Combs actually was. The assembly ended in chaos disguised as order. Colonel Hale handed off the ceremony to the vice principal, who stumbled through the closing remarks with visible difficulty, glancing toward the back of the gym every few seconds. The students were quietly ushered back to their classrooms, buzzing with theories that would only get wilder by lunch period, and Duke refused, flatly refused, to leave Walter's side. The deputy tried 3 times to walk the dog back to the squad car. Each time, Duke planted his paws and would not budge, his body going stiff as a fence post, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. Finally, the colonel intervened. "Let him stay," Hale said quietly. "I want to talk to this man." They found a small office off the gymnasium, usually used for equipment storage, cluttered with deflated basketballs and a broken scoreboard remote, with a metal desk and 2 folding chairs shoved against the wall. Walter sat with his coveralls, still smelling of floor cleaner, his hands folded tightly in his lap so nobody would see them shake. Duke lay across his feet, chin resting on the man's boot, exactly the way a dog lies across the feet of someone he has been waiting years to find. Colonel Hale sat across from him, close enough that their knees nearly touched in the cramped space. "I've handled a lot of working dogs in my time, Mr. Combs," he said. "I've never seen one break formation like that. Not for a stranger. Not for anybody." Walter didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the dog, watching the slow rise and fall of Duke's ribs. "He's not a stranger to me," Walter finally said. You know this dog. Walter's jaw tightened. I know dogs like him. I trained dogs like him a long time ago. The colonel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Trained them where? There was a long pause. Somewhere down the hallway, a bell rang for the next period, muffled through the office door, and the sound of hundreds of sneakers filled the hall outside before fading again. Coronado, Walter said quietly. Then overseas. Different places I'm not supposed to talk about, even now. Colonel Hale's expression shifted, the careful, measured look of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person in front of him. He'd walked into this gymnasium expecting to hand a certificate to a National Guard sergeant. He had not expected to find himself sitting across from a ghost. You were a K9 handler. I was a lot of things, Walter said. That was one of them. He reached down, almost without thinking, and rested his hand on top of Duke's head. The dog leaned into the touch and let out a long breath, the kind of breath that sounds almost human, almost like relief finally given permission to exist. This dog isn't reacting to me because he trained with me, Walter said slowly. Dogs don't remember faces the way people think they do. They remember something deeper. Voice. Scent. The way a person carries their weight when they walk into a room. He looked up at the colonel. Something about me is triggering a memory in him. Something from before he was assigned to this county. Before whatever life he had before this one, he came from a program out west, the deputy said, standing in the doorway, still catching his breath. Retired military working dog, reassigned to us through a federal surplus transfer 2 years ago. His file says he did 3 deployments before that. Walter went very still. What's his handler history say? Walter asked, careful to keep his voice level, even as his pulse hammered against his ribs. Before the transfer, the deputy checked his phone, scrolling through department records with a thumb that had suddenly gone clumsy. Not much here. Some of it's redacted. He was attached to a specialized unit. Name comes back as, the deputy squinted at the screen, Ranger. That was his old call sign before they renamed him Duke for civilian service. Walter's face went the color of ash. Ranger, he repeated. So quietly it was almost lost beneath the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. Colonel Hale watched the janitor's hands begin to tremble. Watched a grown man who mopped this building's floors 5 days a week without anyone giving him a second glance suddenly look like he'd been struck across the chest. Mr. Combs, the colonel said, I think you'd better tell me who you really are. Walter looked down at the dog lying across his boots, the dog who had walked past 300 strangers in a crowded gymnasium to find him, and something in him broke open, quiet and slow, the way a dam doesn't burst all at once but starts with a single crack that widens until there's no holding it back at all. My name isn't just Walter Combs, he said. That's the name I picked when I came home and didn't know how to be a person anymore. My real name, the one on my discharge papers, the one nobody around here has heard in 11 years, is Chief Petty Officer Walter James Combs, United States Navy. SEAL Team 4. The room went silent except for the sound of Duke's tail, thumping once, twice, against the floor. Colonel Hale didn't push for the rest of the story right away. He'd spent enough years in uniform to know that men like Walter didn't hand over their history in one clean piece. It came out in fragments, in pauses, in sentences that started and started again. And the worst thing you could do was rush a man who'd spent 11 years learning how to stay quiet. So he waited. He sent the deputy to fetch coffee from the teacher's lounge, 3 cups, and when the door closed again, leaving just the 2 men and the dog in that cramped equipment room, Walter finally kept going, staring somewhere past the colonel's shoulder, somewhere that wasn't Pennsylvania at all. I enlisted at 19, Walter said. Grew up outside Pittsburgh, steel town. My dad worked the mill until it closed, and then worked nothing, mostly, after that. I wanted out of that town so bad I could taste it. Navy recruiter caught me at just the right moment, told me about Bud SH, and something in me, I don't even know what, just latched onto the idea of being tested that hard, of finding out what I was actually made of. He turned the paper coffee cup slowly in his hands, not drinking from it. Made it through training on my second attempt. Most guys don't make it on the first, if they make it at all. Spent the next several years doing the work. The kind of work I still can't talk about in detail. Not because I'm being dramatic about it, but because some of it's still classified, and some of it just isn't mine to tell without the other men who were there. I understand, Hale said quietly, and meant it. Around 2011, I got selected for a specialized program pairing operators with military working dogs for close protection and explosive detection on high-risk elements. That's where I met Ranger. For the first time since the conversation started, something like a smile flickered across Walter's face, faint and immediately gone, like a light switched on for half a second in a dark house. He was 18 months old when they gave him to me. Wild thing, fastest dog I ever worked with, and stubborn as hell, wouldn't listen to anybody but me within about 3 weeks, which the trainers hated and I secretly loved. Duke's ears twitched at the sound of his old name, and he pressed his head harder against Walter's knee. We did almost 2 years together. Different deployments, different countries I'm not going to name. He found things that would have killed us if he hadn't. More than once. That's just what those dogs do. They walk point on death, over and over. And they don't get medals for it the way we do. And most people never think twice about what that actually costs an animal, carrying that kind of weight every single day. He stopped. His hand had gone still on Duke's head. Our last deployment together, our unit got hit hard during a nighttime operation. I don't remember most of it. Head injury, they told me later. Plus what the doctors called acute stress reaction, which is a polite way of saying my brain just shut down trying to protect itself from what it had seen. I woke up on a medevac bird somewhere over water. Never saw Ranger again. Never got to say goodbye. Never even got told officially what happened to him, whether he made it out, whether he got reassigned, whether he was even still alive. What happened after that? The colonel asked. Walter let out a long breath. 18 months of hospitals. Walter Reed, then a VA facility outside Philadelphia, because that's where they had a bed. Traumatic brain injury, PTSD, the whole file of acronyms they hand you along with a discharge packet like it's supposed to explain your whole life to you from now on. My wife, his voice caught slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. My ex-wife, I should say. She tried. She really did try, for about 2 years, but I wasn't the man she married anymore. And I couldn't blame her for eventually needing to protect our daughter from watching her father disappear into himself every single day. He didn't say more about that part. Colonel Hale didn't ask. I spent 2 years after the divorce trying to track down what happened to Ranger, called every office I could think of, wrote letters, even drove down to a base in Virginia once and sat in a parking lot for 6 hours, hoping somebody would talk to me. Working dog records are a maze on purpose. Half of it's classified, half of it's just bureaucratic nonsense. And after a while, I stopped being able to tell the difference between the system protecting operational security and the system just not caring. So you stopped looking, Hale said. I stopped looking, Walter confirmed. Told myself it was easier that way. Told myself a lot of things were easier that way. Moved out here because it was cheap and quiet, and nobody knew my name. Took the janitor job because nobody asks a janitor hard questions. Built myself a life small enough that it couldn't hurt anybody else if it ever fell apart again." He finally looked up, meeting the Colonel's eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down. And for 11 years, that was enough. It had to be enough, because I didn't think there was anything better waiting for me. And then 2 hours ago, I'm mopping a gymnasium floor, and a dog I thought was gone, forever, walks the length of a room full of strangers just to sit at my feet. Colonel Hale set his own coffee down on the metal desk, untouched. "Mr. Combs," the Colonel said slowly, "I need you to understand something about how these records work. Dogs like this one get transferred between programs their whole careers. Names get changed for civilian handoff, so the public doesn't get attached to a name tied to classified operations. If this dog really is who I think he might be, there's a way to find out for certain. How scar pattern, microchip records. And," the Colonel hesitated, "if he's who you think he is, he'll know a command. Something specific to your unit. Something that wouldn't be in any transfer file. Something that survives every name change and every reassignment, because it was never written down anywhere official in the first place." Walter's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. He looked down at the dog. Ranger, Duke, whatever his name was now, looked back up at him with dark, patient eyes, the same eyes Walter remembered from a rooftop in a country he wasn't allowed to name, the same eyes that had once locked onto a doorway seconds before it exploded and saved 11 men's lives by refusing to move another step forward. Walter took a slow breath. He hadn't said the word in 11 years. He hadn't let himself, not even alone in his apartment on the worst nights, because some part of him had decided that saying it out loud would make the loss permanent in a way that silence never could. "Ankuk," Walter said quietly. The dog's entire body snapped upright. His ears shot forward. His spine went rigid. And then, in a gesture that made the deputy, who had just returned with 3 cups of lukewarm coffee and now stood frozen in the doorway, audibly gasped, and the Colonel rise halfway out of his chair, Duke lifted his right paw off the ground in a slow, deliberate arc and pressed it against his own brow. The closest a dog's body can come to a salute. A trained response drilled into only the most elite working dogs as a visual signal for handler recognition in the field, a command so specialized that it existed in maybe a dozen dogs across the entire military at any given time. Nobody in that small equipment office moved for a full 5 seconds. "Dear God," Colonel Hale whispered. "That's a field recognition command. That's not standard K9 training. That's Naval Special Warfare Protocol. I've read about it. I've never seen it performed." Walter was already on his knees on the floor, arms wrapped around the dog's thick neck, his face buried in fur that smelled like kennel disinfectant instead of desert dust, but underneath it, underneath 11 years and thousands of miles, something in that scent was still exactly the same. "You waited," Walter said into the dog's fur, his voice breaking apart entirely now, all the careful control of the last 11 years finally giving way. "You actually waited for me." Duke made a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a cry, pressing his whole body weight against the man on the floor, and for the first time in 11 years, Walter Combs, janitor, ghost, forgotten hero, allowed himself to sob without trying to stop it, right there on the concrete floor of a supply closet, in front of a Marine colonel and a stunned sheriff's deputy, who both quietly looked away to give him what privacy the small room could offer. Colonel Hale asked him about it only once, weeks later, sitting on Walter's porch with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them. He didn't push. He just said, "If you ever want to tell it properly, I'll listen. Not for a report, not for anybody but you." And on a rainy Sunday afternoon in November, with Ranger asleep between them on the porch boards, Walter finally did. It had been a district in eastern Afghanistan that still, 11 years later, Walter would only ever describe as the Valley, never by its real name, partly because portions of the operation remained classified, and partly because saying the actual name out loud made it too real, too close, too easy to fall back into. Second week of October, 2013. Cold enough at altitude that Walter remembers his breath fogging inside his helmet, remembers Ranger's breath doing the same thing beside him, two small clouds rising side by side in the dark. 11 men. One dog. A compound built into the side of a ridge that intelligence had flagged as a weapons cache and possible high-value target location, the kind of objective that looked clean on a briefing slide and never ever felt clean once boots hit the ground. We'd done maybe 30 operations like it by then, Walter said, his voice low, measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this story in his own head 1,000 times without ever letting it out. Should have been routine. Nothing about it felt different going in. That's usually how the bad ones start. They don't warn you. They moved up the ridge in the dark, no moon, night vision turning the whole world a grainy, textureless green. Ranger walked point beside Walter, the way he always did, nose working constantly, cataloguing the wind the way Walter catalogued shadows. 200 meters out from the compound wall, Ranger stopped. Just stopped dead, Walter said. No bark, no growl, nothing dramatic. He just planted his feet and wouldn't go another step. And I knew right then, that meant something. You learn to trust that stillness more than you trust anything a machine tells you. Walter signaled the element to hold. He crouched beside Ranger, ran a hand along the dog's rigid spine, followed the direction of his fixed stare toward a low stone wall bordering the approach path. A wall the whole team had been about to walk directly alongside. Command post wanted us to push forward on schedule. We were already behind timeline, Walter said. I told them to hold. I trusted the dog over the clock. Command wasn't happy about it in the moment. They were plenty happy about it 20 minutes later. The explosive ordnance disposal team called, forward under Walter's insistence, found a pressure plate device buried along that wall, wired with enough charge to have taken out the lead half of the element in a single blast, which, given the formation they'd been walking in, meant Walter himself. And at least 4 of the men now scattered across the country, the ones who would later become fathers and mechanics, and, in Danny Ruiz's case, a high school football coach in Texas, all of them alive today because a dog refused to take one more step in the dark. That wasn't even the part that got us, Walter said quietly, and here his voice changed, dropped lower, the way it does when a man is walking somewhere in his memory he doesn't visit often. That was just the start of the night. They'd cleared the device, resumed the approach, and reached the compound itself an hour behind schedule. An hour that, in hindsight, gave whoever was inside more than enough time to prepare. The breach went wrong almost immediately. Gunfire from an elevated position nobody's intelligence had flagged. Walter remembers the sound of it more than the sight. Sharp, overlapping cracks that didn't sound real, that never sound real even after you've heard them 100 times before. I took a hit early, round-grazed my vest, knocked the wind clean out of me, and I went down behind a low wall, trying to get my bearings, Walter said. That's when things get blurry. Doctors told me later, I probably took a second impact to the head against the stone when I fell. That's the piece I genuinely don't remember at all. 1 second I'm behind that wall trying to breathe. Next thing I remember clearly is waking up on a medevac bird with somebody's hands pressed against my skull and Ranger nowhere in sight. He stopped talking for a long moment. Ranger, asleep between them on the porch, shifted, let out a soft sound in his sleep, and Walter's hand went automatically to the old dog's side, grounding himself the same way he had for years without ever fully realizing he was doing it. What the after-action report told me, what Colonel Hale read me from that declassified file, is the piece I never knew until this year, Walter continued. While I was down, disoriented, bleeding, but not tracking much of anything, Ranger stayed with me. Wouldn't let anybody approach except our own medic, and even then he was tense about it, standing over me the whole time. But before that, in the minutes right after the ambush started, he'd already done his job. He'd caught the scent of a second device planted near the compound's inner gate, the exact route the rest of the team would have taken to flank the shooters. He alerted hard enough that the element leader diverted the whole approach at the last possible second. Walter shook his head slowly, still, after everything, half in disbelief at his own story. 11 men made it off that ridge that night. 11 men made it home to their families because a dog smelled something twice in 1 hour and refused to let it go unnoticed, even while his own handler was down and bleeding 20 feet away. I didn't know any of that until this year. Colonel, 11 years, and I never knew the full weight of what he did for us that night. I just knew I woke up on a helicopter without him, and I spent over a decade thinking that not knowing what happened to him was some kind of punishment I probably deserved for not protecting him better. Colonel Hale didn't say anything for a while. Rain moved steadily across the porch roof, and Ranger's slow, even breathing filled the silence between them. You didn't fail him, Walter, the colonel finally said. Nothing about that night says you failed him. It says the two of you did exactly what you were trained to do, together, and it cost you both more than either of you should have had to pay. I know that now, Walter said. Took me 11 years and a school gymnasium to actually believe it. It was Danny Ruiz who suggested it, sitting on Walter's porch 2 weeks before the ceremony, turning a cold beer bottle slowly between his hands while Ranger dozed at their feet in the last warm evening of the season. You know there's 10 other guys walking around today because of that dog, Ruiz said. 10 families that exist because of what happened on that ridge. You ever think about that? Not just you and Ranger, everybody else who got to go home and keep living because of what he did. Walter had thought about it more than he wanted to admit in the quiet weeks since Colonel Hale had first read him the declassified summary. But thinking about it and acting on it were two very different things, and some part of him had been afraid to reach further than he already had, afraid of asking for more than the miracle he'd already been given. I wouldn't know how to find most of them, Walter admitted. We scattered after that deployment. Different units, different discharges, different lives. I lost track of everybody except you. I didn't, Ruiz said, and there was something almost sheepish in the way he said it. I've kept a list for years. Never told anybody why. Guess some part of me always figured one day there'd be a reason to use it. Over the following 2 weeks, quietly, without telling Walter the full extent of what he was doing, Danny Ruiz worked his way down that list. Some of the calls were easy, men who'd stayed in touch with each other over the years through veteran networks and reunions. Walter had always declined to attend. Others took real digging. Favors called in from old contacts, a private investigator friend who owed Ruiz something from a previous life. By the time the ceremony date arrived, Ruiz had located 9 of the 10 other men from that ridge. The 10th, a communication specialist named Aaron Cole, had passed away 3 years earlier from complications related to injuries sustained on a later deployment. A fact that hit Walter harder than he expected when Ruiz finally told him, a quiet reminder that not every story from that night had gotten the chance for a happy ending. His widow's coming, though, Ruiz said gently. Said she wanted to see the dog that gave her 10 more years with her husband than she would have had otherwise. Said that mattered to her, even now. 6 of the 9 surviving men were able to make the trip to Millbrook for the ceremony, flying or driving in from as far as Oregon and as close as New Jersey, men Walter hadn't laid eyes on in 11 years. Men whose faces he barely recognized at first beneath the changes time and civilian life had worked on all of them, thicker beards, grayer hair. The softened weight of ordinary living, replacing the leanness of deployment. They gathered the morning before the public ceremony in the high school's teacher's lounge, an unglamorous room with a coffee maker and mismatched chairs. And for nearly 2 hours, nobody outside that room knew what was happening inside it. Just 11 men. Minus the 2 who couldn't be there in body, sitting in a circle around an old Belgian Malinois who moved from person to person. Sniffing hands, resting his head against knees, pausing longest at each face, as though matching some scent memory, 11 years old against the men standing in front of him now. He remembers, said a heavy-set man named Tom Whitfield, who'd been the element's medic that night, kneeling in front of Ranger with tears openly running into his beard. Look at him. He actually remembers all of us. He was the reason my daughter got to meet me, said another, a quiet man named James Okafor, who'd been 6 weeks from becoming a father when the ambush happened, and she's 10 now, 10 years old because of him. I never got the chance to say that to anybody who understood what it meant until right now. Aaron Cole's widow, a soft-spoken woman named Renee, arrived separately, hesitant at the doorway until Walter crossed the room and gently invited her in. She knelt in front of Ranger for a long time, one hand resting on his graying muzzle, saying nothing at all. And when she finally stood, her eyes were dry, but her voice, when she spoke, carried the particular steadiness of someone who has made peace with grief without ever fully setting it down. Aaron used to talk about a dog that saved his life on some mountain he wasn't allowed to name, Renee said. I never knew it was a real animal. I thought it was just something soldiers said, a figure of speech. I'm glad I got to meet him. I'm glad I got to say thank you, even 11 years too late. Walter, standing near the coffee maker with Colonel Hale beside him, watched the room fill slowly with something he hadn't expected to witness. Not just his own reunion with Ranger playing out one more time, but an entire web of lives, quietly, invisibly connected for over a decade by one dog's decision on one dark night to trust his nose over the schedule and to refuse to move. This is bigger than I understood, Walter said quietly to the colonel. I thought I was the only one who needed this. I had no idea how many other people were still carrying it too. That's usually how it works, Hale said. Loss doesn't stay contained to one person. Neither does healing, if you're lucky enough to get the chance at it. That afternoon, before the public ceremony began, the 11 surviving men from that operation, joined by Renee Cole, standing in her husband's place, formed a quiet half-circle around Ranger in the empty gymnasium, no cameras, no reporters, nobody but themselves and a Marine colonel who'd stepped back to let the moment belong entirely to them. One by one, without any planning or coordination, each man knelt in front of the old dog and said something private, something none of them would ever repeat publicly, the kind of gratitude that doesn't need an audience to be real. When the doors opened an hour later and the bleachers began filling with the rest of Millbrook, nobody in the crowd knew that the true ceremony, the one that mattered most to the people who understood what that dog had actually done, had already quietly taken place. Not every visitor who came to Millbrook in those weeks arrived with good intentions. His name was Grant Aldous, a freelance journalist and podcast host who ran a moderately popular show built around exposing what he called failure hero narratives, a niche but vocal corner of the internet that had made him a modest, living, stirring skepticism about viral military stories, usually by digging for any inconsistency, however small, and blowing it into a headline. He arrived in Millbrook the week before the ceremony, uninvited, staying at the town's one motel, and began quietly interviewing anyone who would talk to him. I'm not saying the dog didn't recognize him. Aldous told Priya Anand over coffee at the diner, having tracked down the young reporter whose original footage had helped launch the story nationally. I'm saying there's a pattern with these stories. Struggling veteran, convenient viral moment. Suddenly there's a congresswoman involved and a GoFundMe and a medal ceremony. I've seen this play out before, and it usually turns out messier than the headlines suggest. Anand, to her credit, pushed back. I was there, Grant. I saw that dog's reaction with my own eyes before any of this became a story. There was no GoFundMe until after, and nobody orchestrated a congresswoman showing up. You're building a theory before you've got any evidence for it. But Aldous kept digging anyway, and eventually he found something that looked, on the surface, like exactly what he'd been hunting for. A discrepancy in Walter's official discharge paperwork, an administrative note buried in his VA file referencing a disciplinary review from his final year of active service. A review that, taken entirely out of context, could be made to sound damning to anyone who didn't understand the full story behind it. Aldous published an episode 2 days before the ceremony titled "The Seal They're Not Telling You About," laying out, in his usual breathless style, the existence of the disciplinary note and speculating openly about what Walter might be hiding, suggesting the entire viral moment had been staged or exaggerated by a man looking to rehabilitate a damaged reputation. The episode spread fast, the way skepticism always travels faster than the original good news it's reacting to, and by the morning of the ceremony, Walter's phone was flooded with messages. Some supportive, but plenty from strangers, demanding he explain himself, accusing him of fraud, of manipulating a grieving town for sympathy and money he hadn't actually earned. Walter sat at his kitchen table that morning, ceremony just hours away, staring at his phone with the same hollowed-out expression Colonel Hale remembered from their very first conversation in that equipment closet. "Maybe I shouldn't go today," Walter said when the colonel arrived to pick him up. "Maybe this was a mistake from the start. I never wanted the attention. Now look what it's brought." Hale sat down across from him, unhurried, the way he always was when something needed careful handling instead of urgency. "Walter, I read your full file, every classified page the Navy would clear me for. I know exactly what that disciplinary note is about, and it's not what that man on the internet is implying. Then, tell me you understand why I never talk about it," Walter said quietly. "Because it's not something I'm proud of, even knowing why it happened." The note, it turned out, referenced an incident 8 months before the ambush on the ridge. A physical altercation between Walter and another operator, sparked not by anger or instability, but by that operator's repeated, careless mishandling of a different working dog on their team. Treatment Walter had reported through proper channels twice before finally losing his composure and confronting the man directly. The review had cleared Walter of serious wrongdoing, noting the underlying animal welfare concern was substantiated, but the note remained in his file as a matter of procedure, a footnote to an old conflict that had never once affected his performance or his fitness to serve. "I put my career on the line trying to protect a dog that wasn't even mine because I couldn't stand watching him get mistreated," Walter said. "That's the terrible secret this man thinks he uncovered. That's what he's trying to turn into a scandal." Colonel Hale's jaw tightened. Then we tell that story too, not to attack him, just to tell the truth plainly, and let people decide for themselves what it says about you. That afternoon, before the ceremony began, Colonel Hale released a brief, calm statement to the same local news outlet that had first covered the story, laying out the full context of the disciplinary note with the Navy's cooperation, framed not as a defense but simply as clarification. Priya Anand, who had grown genuinely invested in getting the story right, ran it herself, alongside a pointed editorial, noting that Aldous had published his episode without ever attempting to contact Walter directly for comment. Aldous's episode didn't disappear, and a few corners of the internet clung to their skepticism regardless of the facts, the way some corners always do. But the tide of public sentiment, which had wavered for less than 24 hours, swung back hard and fast once the full context emerged. If anything, the story of a young sailor, risking his own career to defend a mistreated working dog, only deepened the town's affection for the quiet janitor who mopped their gymnasium floors. "You didn't need to defend yourself for that," Emily told her father that evening after the ceremony, sitting beside him on the porch while Ranger dozed between them. "Anybody who actually knows you would understand exactly why you did what you did back then." "Maybe," Walter said, "but I spent so many years assuming the worst version of every story about myself would eventually come out and confirm what I already believed, that I wasn't worth defending. Guess I had to learn, a little late, that the truth was actually on my side the whole time. I just never gave anybody the chance to hear it." Ranger shifted between them, resting his graying head against Walter's leg, and somewhere down the quiet street, a porch light clicked on against the gathering dusk, steady and warm, the same as it had been every evening since the day a dog refused to heel and walked the length of a gymnasium to bring a forgotten man back into the light. Word moves fast in a small town, and it moves faster when 300 teenagers all pull out their phones the second they get home. By that evening, a shaky 10-second video of a police dog saluting the school janitors had been shared over 4,000 times on local community pages. By the next morning, a Millbrook parent had posted it with the caption, "Does anyone know who this man is? My daughter says the dog acted like he knew him." By that afternoon, the video had crossed into regional news pages, then a veterans advocacy account with 200,000 followers, and by the end of the week it had been viewed in various reposted forms more than 3 million times. Nobody had answers yet, not publicly. Walter had asked the colonel, quietly, desperately, to keep the details private for a few days, not because he was ashamed, but because 11 years of invisibility does not disappear in a single afternoon, and a man needs time to remember how to be seen before the entire internet decides to look at him all at once. But some things cannot stay quiet once a working dog and a forgotten hero have found each other in front of 300 witnesses with smartphones. The first crack in that privacy came from a local news reporter named Priya Anand, 26 years old and hungry for a story that would finally get her noticed beyond the Millbrook Gazette's dwindling print circulation. She showed up at the school on Thursday morning, uninvited, camera crew in tow, and cornered Walter in the parking lot before his shift even started. "Mr. Combs, is it true you were a Navy SEAL?" she asked, microphone already extended, camera light already blinking red. "Can you tell our viewers how the dog recognized you? Is it true the county is fighting to keep him?" Walter froze, keys still in his hand, halfway between his rusted pickup truck and the school's side entrance. 11 years of careful invisibility screamed at him to walk away, to say nothing, to disappear back into the anonymity that had kept him safe for so long. but Ranger, who had been riding in the passenger seat that morning, already unofficially back in Walter's custody while the paperwork worked its way through channels, pressed his head against Walter's hip, steady and warm, and something in that contact gave Walter just enough ground to stand on. "I'd appreciate some privacy," Walter said, his voice tight but civil. "This is a personal matter. But surely the public has a right to know about a hero living quietly in their community," Anand pressed, stepping closer. And something about the phrase, "a hero living quietly," made Walter's jaw clench in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her, and everything to do with 11 years of nobody using that word anywhere near his name. "I'm not a hero," Walter said. "I'm a man who lost his dog and got him back. That's the whole story. Please respect that." He walked past her into the building, and to her credit, Anand didn't push further that day. But the story was already loose in the world, and stories like that one don't stay contained for long. Not in an age where a 10-second clip can travel farther in an afternoon than Walter's entire life had traveled in the 11 years since he came home. What surprised Walter most in the days that followed wasn't the attention itself, but the shape it took once it settled over Millbrook. He'd braced himself for gawking for the particular kind of scrutiny he remembered from his earliest, hardest month home from war, when even a trip to the grocery store had felt like walking through a gauntlet of well-meaning strangers who didn't know what to say and said the wrong thing anyway. Instead, what he found waiting for him each morning was something gentler and in its own way harder to absorb. The owner of the hardware store on Main Street, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Peggy Rourke, who had exchanged maybe a dozen words with Walter in 6 years of him buying replacement mop heads and light bulbs for the school, stopped him outside her shop one morning with a paper bag in her hands. "Figured your dog could use a proper bed," she said gruffly, thrusting the bag toward him before he could protest. "Saw the video. My husband served 2 tours in Vietnam. Died without hardly anybody ever saying thank you to his face. Wasn't going to let that happen twice in this town if I could help it." Walter, caught entirely off guard, managed only a quiet thank you before she waved him off and disappeared back into her shop, and he stood on the sidewalk for a long moment afterward, the paper bag heavy in his hands, feeling something shift loose in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. It kept happening in small ways all through that week. A veteran 2 towns over drove 40 minutes just to shake Walter's hand outside the grocery store and say nothing else at all. A group of students left a hand-painted sign outside the school's side entrance that simply read "Welcome Home, Ranger" in bright, uneven letters. An elderly woman who attended the same small church Walter hadn't set foot in for years mailed him a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, describing her own son's deployment and the dog he'd trained with who never made it home, thanking Walter simply for reminding her that some stories still ended differently. "It's strange," Walter told Colonel Hale one evening, sorting through a small stack of similar letters that had begun accumulating on his kitchen table. 11 years I spent making sure nobody in this town really saw me. Now I can't walk to my truck without somebody wanting to shake my hand or tell me about somebody they lost. I don't know what to do with all of it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Hale said. "You don't owe anybody a performance of gratitude just because they're offering their own. Take what feels good, let the rest pass through you. That's allowed too." Not every letter, however, arrived with such simple kindness attached. Sheriff Deputy Chief Raymond Tilford watched the video for the first time on his own phone, sitting in his office with the door closed, and felt something considerably less generous than the wave of public emotion sweeping through Millbrook's Facebook groups. Tilford was a man who had spent 14 years building a department budget line by line, who had personally lobbied the county commissioners for the funds to acquire Duke through the federal surplus program. 2 years earlier, and who now watched a viral video threaten to strip that asset away based on nothing more than a dog's dramatic behavior and a stranger's sentimental backstory. $11,000. Tilford muttered to his desk sergeant the next morning, tapping a folder that contained the department's acquisition paperwork. That dog cost this county $11,000 plus training, plus 2 years of veterinary care and equipment. I've got 3 more years of budget projections built around having an active K9 unit, and now half the town wants me to just hand him over because of a viral video. Chief, with respect, the sergeant said carefully, "Did you see the footage? That dog's never acted like that. Not once in the 2 years I've worked with him." "I don't care what the dog did," Tilford snapped, more sharply than he intended. "I care about what the department needs. Sentiment doesn't replace a working K9 unit, and I'm not setting a precedent where any old veteran who shows up with a sad story can walk off with county property." Word of Tilford's resistance reached Walter through Colonel Hale 2 days later, delivered as gently as possible, but it landed hard regardless. For a man who had spent over a decade convincing himself that hoping for good things only led to disappointment, the sudden threat of losing Ranger again, now, after everything, after finally being found, felt like a physical blow. "They can't just take him back," Walter said, sitting across from the colonel in the same small equipment office, his hands gripping the edge of the folding chair hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. "He's not property. He's not a piece of equipment. Walter's voice cracked. "He's the only family I've got left that actually remembers who I was before all this." "I know," Hale said quietly, "and I'm not going to let that happen without a fight. But I need you to understand something about how this works, Walter. Bureaucracies don't move on emotion. They move on process and pressure, and sometimes on people with enough influence to make the process move faster than it wants to. So what do we do?" The colonel was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. "I've got a phone call to make," he said finally. "One I should have made 2 days ago, but I wanted to give the county a chance to do the right thing on their own first. Looks like they're not going to." The phone call Colonel Hale made that evening went to a woman named Representative Diane Marsh, whom he'd served alongside briefly during a joint congressional military liaison assignment years earlier, back when Marsh was still a junior staffer instead of a sitting member of the House Veterans Affairs Subcommittee. She remembered him instantly. "Robert Hale," she said. Warmth evident even through the phone line. "It's been years. Tell me you're not calling about a budget hearing, because I genuinely don't have the bandwidth this week." "Nothing that boring," Hale said, and then, over the next 15 minutes, told her everything: the assembly, the dog, the salute, the 11 years of silence, and now a county sheriff's department digging in its heels over an $11,000 acquisition line item, while a decorated veteran sat in a school parking lot trying to explain to a reporter why he wasn't a hero. Marsh was silent for a long moment after he finished. "Send me the video," she said finally. "And Robert, I want everything you've got. Service record, deployment history, whatever's not still classified. I think this is exactly the kind of story that reminds people why the humanitarian transfer provisions exist in the first place." 2 days later, Marsh's office had confirmed, through official Navy channels, everything Walter had told the colonel in that cramped equipment room. Ranger, service number K9, 2291, had indeed served alongside Chief Petty Officer Walter Combs during 2 overseas deployments with SEAL Team 4 between 2011 and 2013. Ranger had been credited in a heavily redacted after-action report, finally pulled from archive by a records officer who understood the urgency behind Marsh's request. With detecting an improvised explosive device that would have killed the entire 11-man element, Walter was attached to during a nighttime operation outside a compound whose location remained classified to this day. Walter had never been told that detail. In the chaos of the medevac, in the blur of surgeries and hospital transfers that followed, nobody had ever sat him down and told him that the dog he lost had, in his very last mission alongside him, saved his life and the lives of 10 other men. When Colonel Hale read him that line from the declassified summary, sitting once again in the cramped equipment office with Ranger asleep across both their boots, Walter didn't cry this time. He just sat very still, staring at nothing, the way men do when a piece of themselves they thought was permanently missing gets handed back to them all at once. "He saved us," Walter said finally. "I always wondered. I used to lay in that hospital bed and wonder if it even mattered what we did over there, whether any of it meant anything. And this whole time, he knew. He always knew what he did, and I never got to thank him." "You can now," the colonel said quietly. Representative Marsh arrived in Millbrook herself 3 days later, a decision her staff had gently questioned given her schedule, but one she insisted on making personally. "Some stories," she told her chief of staff on the drive up, "deserve more than a press release with my name on it." She walked into the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office parking lot on a Tuesday morning, silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, wearing a blazer with a small congressional pin on the lapel, flanked by 2 staffers, one holding a phone raised to record. Not for social media this time, but as a precaution, the kind of quiet documentation that experienced political operators know to keep on hand. Deputy Chief Tilford was standing in the lot, arguing with Walter and Colonel Hale when she arrived, his sunglasses on, despite the overcast sky, his arms crossed in the universal posture of a man who has already decided he isn't moving. "That dog is county property," Tilford was saying flatly. "He's assigned to active patrol duty. I don't care what happened at some school assembly. We're not in the business of sentimental transfers." "Chief Tilford, that dog has spent 2 days refusing food from anyone but this man," Colonel Hale said, his voice level, the voice of a man used to negotiating far worse standoffs than this one. "Your own deputies told me he wouldn't eat last night, until Mr. Combs was allowed to sit with him in the kennel." "That's not my problem," Tilford said. "That dog cost this department $11,000 to acquire through the federal surplus program. I'm not writing him off because of a viral video." Walter, who had stayed quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke. "I'm not asking you to write him off," Walter said. "I'm asking to buy him back, whatever it costs. I'll take a second job. I'll sell my truck. I've got savings I never touch because I never had anything worth spending it on. I'm asking you to let an old dog retire with the man who trained him to survive." "You think I haven't heard sob stories before, Mr. Combs?" Tilford said, his voice hardening further, something defensive creeping into it, now that hadn't been there a moment earlier. "I've got deputies out on patrol tonight who'd love a K9 partner and don't have one because the budget only stretched to 1 dog. You think it's fair I strip that resource away from an active department because a video got some likes?" "It's not about likes," Colonel Hale cut in, his own patience thinning now. "It's about a documented, verified service history that predates this department's acquisition of that animal by 2 full years. That dog served this country in combat, before he ever wore a county badge. You're talking about him like he's a squad car you bought second-hand. He is county equipment, Colonel, whether you like the framing or not, Tilford snapped back. I don't get to make department decisions based on sentiment. I've got a commissioner breathing down my neck about budget overruns as it is. And now you want me to explain writing off an $11,000 asset because a janitor cried in a supply closet. The words landed hard, and Walter visibly flinched, his jaw tightening as 11 years of carefully cultivated invisibility rose up in him like a reflex, the old instinct to simply absorb the insult and disappear rather than fight back. But this time, something held him in place. Maybe it was Ranger pressed steady against his leg. Maybe it was simply that he was tired, after everything, of shrinking himself for other people's convenience. I wasn't crying because I'm weak, Chief Tilford, Walter said, his voice quiet but steady, carrying more weight than the deputy chief's raised voice had managed. I was crying because I spent 11 years thinking I'd never see that dog again, and he remembered me before I even said a word. You can call that sentiment if it makes the paperwork easier for you. I call it the only thing that's felt real to me in over a decade. Tilford opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately. For a moment, the parking lot held only the sound of the wind rattling the flagpole chain, and something in Walter's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to finally register with the deputy chief in a way the colonel's arguments hadn't managed. Department policy doesn't work that way, Tilford said, but there was less certainty in his voice now, the bluster of a moment earlier already beginning to erode. Then maybe it's time the policy changed, said a new voice. Every head in the parking lot turned. Representative Marsh stepped forward, extending a hand toward Tilford, who visibly straightened, his sunglasses coming off in a reflexive show of respect he hadn't offered anyone else in the conversation so far. Representative Diane Marsh, she said. I sit on the House Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, Chief Tilford, and I happened to see a video last night of a retired Navy SEAL being saluted by the same working dog who saved his unit's life a decade ago. I think that's the kind of story America needs to see handled with a little more grace than a budget line item. Tilford's face had gone pale. Ma'am, I wasn't aware. I'd like to help facilitate a transfer, Marsh continued smoothly. There are federal provisions for retired military working dogs to be reunited with former handlers under specific humanitarian circumstances. I imagine, given the documentation the Navy has already confirmed, this case qualifies rather easily. I'd hate for a local budget dispute to become a national conversation about how we treat our veterans and the dogs who served beside them. I've already had 3 separate news outlets ask my office for comment on this story. So far, I've declined to give one. I'd prefer to keep it that way, if we can resolve this like reasonable people. The parking lot went dead silent, except for the wind rattling a nearby flagpole, its chain clanging softly against the metal pole in a rhythm that felt, to Walter, almost like a countdown. Tilford looked at Walter. He looked at Ranger, sitting calm and steady at Walter's side, watching the deputy chief with the same unreadable patience he'd shown in the gymnasium 2 weeks earlier. Fine, Tilford said finally, his voice tight. Paperwork's on my desk. Give me a week. Give him 3 days, Marsh said pleasantly, already turning back toward her car. I'll be following up personally. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Walter's life, longer, in some ways, than the 11 years that had come before them. But they were also interrupted, unexpectedly, by something Walter had not prepared for at all. On Wednesday evening, sitting on his porch steps, with Ranger's head heavy in his lap, Walter's phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it. Spam calls and scam texts had become such a constant nuisance that he'd trained himself to dismiss anything from a number he didn't recognize, but something made him open it anyway. "Dad, I saw the video. Is this really you?" Walter's chest seized. He sat frozen on the porch step for nearly a full minute before he could make his thumbs move. His daughter, Emily, had been 11 years old, the last time he'd seen her in person. A small, serious girl with her mother's dark hair who used to fall asleep on his chest while he was still deployed. Back before everything, in the photographs he kept but never looked at anymore because looking at them hurt too much to be worth it. She would be 22 now. He did the math automatically, the way he always did on her birthday, every October, alone, never calling, because he didn't know what he'd even say after so many years of silence. After a divorce that had ended not with anger but with something worse, his own quiet withdrawal from a life he'd convinced himself he no longer deserved to be part of. "It's me," he typed back, his hands shaking harder than they had in the equipment closet 2 weeks earlier. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to reach out." "I didn't think you'd want me to," the reply came almost instantly. "I've wanted you to for 11 years. Mom always told me you loved me, but you were sick and it wasn't safe to push. I didn't understand that as a kid. I think I understand it a little better now. Can I come see you? I live in Ohio now. It's not that far." Walter read the message 4 times before he could bring himself to answer. Ranger's warm weight pressed against his leg the entire time, as if the old dog understood, somehow, that this moment needed the same steady presence he'd offered in the equipment closet. "Yes," Walter typed finally. "Please. I'd like that more than you know." He didn't sleep much that night, not from the old nightmares that had plagued him for years, but from something entirely different, a nervous, fragile hope he hadn't let himself feel in over a decade, sitting alongside a grief for all the years he'd missed that no viral video or medal ceremony could ever give back to him. Emily arrived in Millbrook on Saturday afternoon, 4 days after her first message, driving a modest sedan with an Ohio state parking permit still stuck to the windshield. Walter stood on his porch, unable to make himself walk down the steps, watching her get out of the car with a nervousness that mirrored his own. She looked so much like her mother, it made his throat close up entirely. The same dark hair, though longer now, the same serious eyes that had, as a child, always seemed to be studying him a little too carefully, as though she sensed even then that something in her father carried weight he never spoke about. "Dad," she said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps, her voice uncertain. "Emily." He said her name like it was something fragile, something he was afraid of breaking just by speaking it aloud. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Ranger, who had been sitting patiently beside Walter's leg, walked down the steps on his own, tail wagging in a slow, careful arc, and pressed his head against Emily's hand, exactly the way he'd learned, over the past 2 weeks, to offer comfort to people standing at the edge of something they were afraid to cross. Emily laughed, a small, surprised sound, half a sob mixed in with it, and crouched down to bury her face against the dog's neck, the same way her father had done in that equipment closet 2 weeks earlier. "I saw the video like 50 times, she said, still crouched, still not quite ready to look up at her father directly. "I couldn't believe it was you. Mom always said you were a hero. I never really understood what that meant until I saw you on that gym floor." "I'm not sure I understand it either," Walter admitted, finally finding the courage to walk down the last few steps. "I spent 11 years thinking I didn't deserve to be found by anybody." Emily finally looked up at him, tears on her face, but something steady in her expression too. Something that reminded him painfully of the strength her mother had always carried. "You're allowed to be found, Dad," she said. "You always were. I just wish somebody had told you that sooner." They stood together on that porch for a long time afterward, father and daughter and the dog who had, without meaning to, opened a door that had been sealed shut for over a decade. And for the first time since coming home from war, Walter Combs let himself imagine what it might feel like to be part of a family again. That evening, Walter cooked dinner for the first time in longer than he could remember, cooking for anyone but himself. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, the same meal Karen used to make on Fridays, back when Emily was small enough to stand on a kitchen chair and stir the sauce with both hands wrapped around the wooden spoon. Emily noticed the detail immediately. "You remembered," she said, sitting at the small kitchen table while Walter moved awkwardly between the stove and the counter, clearly out of practice, but trying hard anyway. "Mom used to make this every Friday." "I didn't think you'd remember something that small." "I remember more than you'd think," Walter admitted, not looking up from the pot. "I just didn't let myself think about it very often. Some memories hurt too much to visit casually. You learn to keep the door shut on the good ones right alongside the bad ones, because your mind doesn't always know how to separate the two once it starts opening doors at all." Emily was quiet for a moment, watching her father's back, the tension still held in his shoulders even now. Weeks into whatever this new chapter was becoming, is that what these 11 years were? Just keeping doors shut, mostly, Walter said. "I told myself I was protecting you and your mother. Told myself you were both better off without a man who couldn't sleep through a thunderstorm without checking every window in the house first." Some of that was probably true, early on. But I think somewhere along the way, protecting you turned into an excuse. It got easier to stay gone than to try and fail at being your father again. "You could have failed and I still would have wanted you there," Emily said quietly. "That's the part I wish somebody had told you. Nobody needed you to be perfect, Dad. We just needed you to still be around." Walter set the wooden spoon down and finally turned to face her, his eyes wet in a way he no longer bothered to hide from his own daughter. "I know that now. I wasted more years than I can ever get back believing the opposite. I can't undo that. All I can do is show up for whatever time we've got left, starting tonight." Over dinner, Emily told him about her life in a way she'd never been able to over the brief, awkward phone calls they'd attempted years earlier. Her job as a physical therapist, the apartment she shared with a college roommate turned lifelong friend, a boyfriend named Marcus she'd been seeing for 8 months, and was nervous, still, about introducing to her father. Walter listened to every word like it was the most important information he'd ever received, asking questions, laughing genuinely for what felt like the first time in years, and Ranger lay under the table between them the entire meal, his tail thumping softly against the floor every time the conversation turned warm. "I want to meet him," Walter said finally, when Emily mentioned Marcus a second time. "Whenever you're ready, no pressure. I just don't want to miss any more of your life than I already have." Emily smiled. The same smile Walter remembered from when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders through the base commissary. "He'd like that. He's actually the one who showed me the video in the first place." Said something about the way that dog moved, made him stop scrolling immediately. Guess I owe him for that. They stayed at the table long after the food had gone cold, Emily eventually pulling out her phone to show her father 11 years of photographs he'd never seen. Her high school graduation, a college trip to the Grand Canyon, a clumsy attempt at baking a birthday cake that had partially collapsed in the oven. Walter absorbed each image slowly, deliberately, as though trying to physically install the missing years back into his memory through sheer force of attention, grateful for every ordinary, unremarkable moment he'd missed and determined, quietly, not to miss whatever came next. "I'm not going anywhere again," Walter told her before she left that night, standing beside her car in the cool evening air, Ranger sitting patiently at his side. "Whatever this new version of us looks like, I'm staying for it. All of it. The good visits and the hard ones both." "I'm holding you to that," Emily said, hugging him tightly before climbing into the driver's seat. "Both of you," she added, crouching once more to press a kiss to the top of Ranger's graying head. "Take care of him tonight, okay? I think he's earned an easy one." Marcus came to Millbrook for the first time 3 weeks later on a bright, cold Saturday afternoon. And Walter spent the better part of the morning cleaning a house that hadn't needed cleaning in years, moving furniture that didn't need to be moved, doing anything he could think of with his hands to keep from sitting still with his nerves. "You'd think I was meeting your commanding officer," Colonel Hale said dryly, having stopped by that morning under the thin pretense of returning a borrowed drill and staying to watch Walter's nervous circling with obvious amusement. "It's a 24-year-old kid, Walter, not a court-martial board." "It's my daughter's boyfriend," Walter said, straightening a stack of magazines on the coffee table for the third time. "There's a difference. A court-martial board doesn't get to decide whether my daughter's happy." When Emily's car finally pulled into the driveway, Walter made himself stand on the porch rather than hover at the door, Ranger sitting calmly at his side, tail wagging in the slow, easy rhythm he reserved for people he'd already decided he liked. Marcus climbed out of the passenger seat first, tall, a little gangly, visibly nervous in a way that Walter, despite his own anxiety, found immediately endearing, since it told him plainly that this young man understood exactly how much this visit mattered. "Mr. Combs," Marcus said, extending a hand that was noticeably damp with nerves, "it's an honor to meet you. Genuinely, Emily's told me so much, and I've watched that video probably 50 times, so I've heard," Walter said, shaking his hand, and something in the kid's earnestness eased the tightness in his own chest more than he expected. "Come on in. Ranger already likes you, apparently, which is more than I can say for most people who show up on this porch." They spent the afternoon on the back deck, the late autumn sun weak but present. Ranger stretched out contentedly between them, while Marcus, gradually relaxing, told Walter about his work as a high school science teacher, 2 towns over from Emily's apartment, about how he'd met her at a mutual friend's birthday dinner and spent the entire evening too nervous to say more than a few words to her. "Took me 3 weeks to work up the nerve to ask her out properly," Marcus admitted, glancing sideways at Emily, who rolled her eyes fondly. "She had to basically ask me herself in the end." "He's exaggerating," Emily said. "It was 2 weeks. And I only helped things along a little." Walter watched the easy affection between them, the comfortable teasing, the way Marcus's hand found Emily's without either of them seeming to think about it, and felt something settle in him that he hadn't expected to feel this soon. Not just approval, though there was plenty of that, but a kind of quiet relief, the specific relief of a father watching his daughter be genuinely, unremarkably happy. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said later, as the afternoon began sliding toward evening, and Emily had gone inside to help herself to more coffee, leaving the 2 of them alone on the deck with Ranger dozing between their chairs. "Emily told me a little about the years you 2 lost touch. I don't want to overstep. But I guess I wondered, was there a specific moment you decided things needed to change? Or did it just sort of happen gradually?" Walter considered the question for a long moment, his hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the old dog's steady, familiar warmth beneath his palm. "Both, I think," Walter said finally. The gradual part had been building for years without me really noticing. Some quiet, buried part of me getting tired of hiding, even while the rest of me kept insisting hiding was safer. But the specific moment was easy to point to. It was watching this dog walk across a gymnasium floor toward a version of me I'd almost convinced myself didn't deserve to be found. Once that happened, I couldn't keep pretending the old way of living made any sense anymore. Sometimes you need something outside yourself to prove you wrong about who you are, because you can't always talk yourself out of 11 years of bad thinking on your own. Marcus nodded slowly, clearly turning the answer over in his mind. "For what it's worth, I'm glad he found you." Emily lit up in a completely different way once you two reconnected. I don't think I fully understood how much she'd been carrying until I watched some of that weight lift off her. She carried more than she should have had to, Walter admitted. "That's on me, not her. I'm trying to make up for lost time as best I can. Doesn't erase the years, but it's what I've got to offer now." "I think that's all any of us really have to offer anybody," Marcus said. "What we've got now, she seems to think it's enough. For what it's worth, so do I." When Emily returned to the deck a few minutes later, she found her father and her boyfriend sitting in comfortable silence, Ranger's tail thumping softly against the deck boards between them, and something in the easy quiet of the scene told her, without either of them needing to say a word, that the afternoon had gone exactly the way she'd hoped it would. "You two look suspiciously friendly," she said, settling into the empty chair beside Marcus. "Should I be worried? Just getting to know each other," Walter said. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, it meant every ordinary word of it completely. Grateful for an afternoon that asked nothing more of him than to sit on his own back deck, in his own quiet town, surrounded by people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stay. The transfer paperwork came through on the 4th day, not the 7th, expedited quietly, by people who understood that some things shouldn't wait for bureaucracy to catch up with decency. Representative Marsh's office had made 2 additional calls that Walter never heard about, one to a regional Navy public affairs officer who agreed that a positive, well-documented reunification story served the service's interests far better than a prolonged budget dispute playing out in local news, and one to Tilford's own county commissioner, who quietly suggested that continued resistance might not play well in an election year. The sheriff's department held a small handover at the county kennel, more subdued than anyone expected, given how the story had exploded online. Deputy Chief Tilford, to his credit, showed up personally, and when he unclipped Duke's department collar for the last time, he crouched down and scratched the dog behind the ears, in a way that suggested, whatever his objections about budgets and policy, he had grown to respect the animal in his own gruff way. "He's a good dog," Tilford said, standing and handing the leash to Walter. "Take care of him." "I intend to," Walter said, "for however many years he's got left, and I intend to make every one of them count for both of us." "For what it's worth," Tilford added, somewhat stiffly, as though the words cost him something to produce, "I read your file. The parts that aren't classified, anyway. What you did over there, what he did, that's not nothing. I was wrong to make this about a budget line." Walter, surprised, extended his hand. Tilford shook it, brief but firm. Duke, Ranger, sat between them for a moment, looking up at Walter, with an expression that anyone who has ever loved a dog will recognize instantly. Not confusion, not uncertainty, but a kind of settled, total peace. The look of a creature who has finally arrived exactly where he was always supposed to be. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later, back in the same Route 9 high school gymnasium, though this time nothing about it resembled the quiet, half-attended assembly that had started everything. The bleachers were packed, not just with students but with families, veterans from 3 surrounding counties, local news vans parked outside, and, standing near the front, at Representative Marsh's personal invitation, a small delegation from the Navy, including 2 men Walter hadn't seen in 11 years, former teammates from SEAL Team 4, men who had questioned for over a decade what had happened to the quiet, broken chief who'd been medevaced out and simply vanished from their lives afterward. "We tried to find you," one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Danny Ruiz, told Walter backstage before the ceremony began, gripping his hand hard enough to hurt. "Man, we tried for years. Then everybody just figured you didn't want to be found, and we respected that, but it never sat right. Not knowing, I didn't want to be found," Walter admitted. "I didn't think there was anything left worth finding." Ruiz looked down at Ranger, sitting calm and alert beside Walter's leg, and shook his head slowly. "Turns out there was." Emily stood nearby, dressed carefully for the occasion. Having driven back from Ohio for the ceremony without a second thought, and beside her, unexpectedly, stood her mother, Walter's ex-wife, Karen, whom Emily had quietly reached out to the week before, and who had shown up not out of any renewed romantic hope, but out of a simple human recognition that some moments deserve to be witnessed by everyone who once loved you, whatever shape that love had eventually taken. "I'm proud of you," Karen told Walter quietly, before the ceremony began, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "I always was. I just couldn't watch you disappear anymore. I hope you understand that now." "I do," Walter said, and meant it, feeling something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for over a decade. "I understand a lot of things now that I didn't before." When the ceremony began, Colonel Hale stood at the same podium where, weeks earlier, he had been midway through reading off a stranger's biography when a dog decided the real story of the day was standing at the back of the room. This time, there was no biography card. This time, he spoke without notes. 11 years ago, the colonel said, his voice carrying clean through the gymnasium, a young Navy chief and his working dog walked into a compound most of us will never be allowed to know the name of, and that dog's nose found something that would have killed 11 men in the next 3 steps. The chief came home, broken, but home. The dog was reassigned through channels none of us fully understand, and for over a decade, these 2 men, because make no mistake, that dog is a man's best kind of brother, lived less than 400 miles apart, both of them wondering if the other one still remembered. The gym was utterly silent. Even the ceiling lights seemed to have stopped their usual hum. 2 weeks ago, Hale continued, in this very room, that dog answered the question for both of them. He turned to Walter standing at the edge of the stage in a borrowed dress uniform that fit imperfectly but meant everything. Ranger. Sitting steady and proud at his side, Chief Petty Officer Walter James Combs. On behalf of the United States Navy, it is my long overdue honor to present you with the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for actions during your final deployment that saved the lives of 11 of your fellow service members. This award should have found you 11 years ago. I'm sorry it took this long. I am not sorry it finally did. The applause that followed didn't feel like applause for a school assembly. It rolled through the gymnasium like something physical, something that had been building pressure for over a decade and had finally found release. Students who had walked past Walter in the hallway 100 times without a second glance were on their feet. Teachers were crying openly. Danny Ruiz and the other SEAL team veterans stood at rigid attention, hands raised in a slow, deliberate salute of their own. Emily, standing between her mother and Colonel Hale's wife, wept openly and without embarrassment, clapping so hard her palms turned red. Walter stood there, medal in hand, and did the only thing that felt true. He knelt down, right there on the gymnasium floor in front of 300 people, and wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck. "We made it, buddy," he whispered, just loud enough for the microphone near the stage to catch it, just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "We finally made it home." Ranger pressed his head into Walter's shoulder and then, slowly, deliberately, lifted his paw one more time and pressed it against his own brow. The gymnasium erupted. It took nearly a full minute for the applause to settle enough for Colonel Hale to speak again. And when it finally did, he wasn't finished. He raised a hand, waiting for the last of the noise to fade, and something in his posture told the room he had one more thing to say. "There's a second part to this ceremony," the colonel said, "that most of you don't know is coming, because the men involved asked that it happen quietly, without fanfare, and I intend to honor that request as much as the moment allows." He gestured toward the side of the stage, and one by one, the surviving members of that 11-man element stepped forward from where they'd been standing quietly among the crowd. Danny Ruiz first, then Tom Whitfield, then James Okafor, and the 4 others who had made the trip, followed last by Renee Cole, walking with quiet dignity in her husband's place. They formed a loose line beside Walter, and the gymnasium, sensing the weight of what was happening, even without being told the full story, fell into a hush more profound than the silence that had followed the salute itself. "Every man standing here today," Colonel Hale said, "is alive because of the dog sitting in front of you, not in some abstract symbolic sense, in the most literal sense there is. On the night this medal commemorates, this animal detected 2 separate explosive devices that would have killed some or all of these men, and then stood over his wounded handler in the middle of an active firefight, refusing to let anyone but a medic approach until help arrived." He paused, letting that settle over the crowd. "We don't have a medal in the US, military inventory, that adequately honors what a working dog does in moments like that. So today, with the cooperation of the Navy and this community, we're establishing one anyway. Informally, but permanently. Millbrook, meet the first recipient of what this town has decided to call the Loyal Guardian Commendation. A woman from the school's art department, who had spent the previous week secretly working with Colonel Hale's staff, wheeled forward a small cart carrying a custom-engraved collar tag, simple but weighty, catching the gymnasium lights as Hale lifted it for the crowd to see, before kneeling down to fasten it gently around Ranger's neck alongside his everyday collar. Ranger sat perfectly still for the fastening, then turned his head to look up at Walter, and something passed between the man and the dog in that moment that needed no further ceremony to explain itself. James Okafor stepped forward next, unprompted, kneeling in front of Ranger with his hand resting flat against the dog's chest. "My daughter's out there in the crowd today," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear, gesturing toward a young girl sitting beside her mother in the 3rd row of bleachers, wide-eyed and silent. "She's 10 years old. She exists because of this dog. I don't know how you thank something for that. I've been trying to find the words for 11 years, and I still don't have them. So I'm just going to say thank you and hope he understands what that means, even if the words aren't big enough." By the time the last of the 11 men had spoken, there wasn't a dry eye left in the gymnasium, and even the local news cameramen, who had covered plenty of ceremonies over the years, found themselves setting down their equipment for a moment, simply to watch rather than record. Life in Millbrook didn't return to what it had been before, not entirely, and Walter didn't need it to. But the months that followed the ceremony brought their own quieter challenges. The kind that don't make headlines but test a family's newfound footing all the same. It happened on a grey morning in early December, almost 2 months after the assembly that had started everything. Walter woke to find Ranger struggling to rise from his dog bed in the corner of the bedroom, his back legs trembling, his breathing shallow and quick in a way that sent ice straight through Walter's chest. "Hey, hey, easy, buddy," Walter said, dropping to his knees beside the old dog, running his hands along Ranger's ribs, feeling for anything obviously wrong, and finding nothing but the dog's labored breath and the fear in his own dark eyes. "Talk to me. What's going on?" He didn't wait for an answer that would never come. He carried Ranger, 65 pounds of muscle gone suddenly, frighteningly limp, out to his truck and drove faster than he had in years toward the emergency veterinary clinic 2 towns over, running 2 stop signs along the way, and not caring in the slightest. The veterinarian, a calm, efficient woman named Dr. Osei, met them at the door and had Ranger on an exam table within minutes. Walter paced the small waiting room for nearly an hour, unable to sit, unable to think about anything except the sound of Ranger's labored breathing in the truck, the way the old dog had looked up at him with something like an apology in his eyes, as though he were sorry for scaring him. When Dr. Osei finally came out, her expression was carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to hold their faces when the news isn't good, but isn't hopeless either. "His heart's showing some strain," she said. "It's not uncommon in working dogs his age, especially ones who've had the kind of physical demands placed on them that a dog like Ranger clearly has, based on his old scarring and joint wear. We can manage it with medication. He's got good years left in him, Mr. Combs, but I won't lie to you, his body has been through a lot and it's starting to show its age." Walter sat down hard in one of the waiting room chairs, his legs no longer willing to hold him up. "How many years?" he asked quietly. "Roughly, if I do everything right. Could be 2, could be 4 or 5, if we manage things carefully and he stays active but not overexerted." Dr. Osei said gently. "I know that's not the answer you wanted." "No," Walter admitted. "But it's more than I thought I'd ever get with him again. I'll take every day you can give us." He was allowed back to see Ranger a few minutes later, the old dog lying quietly on a padded exam table with an IV line taped carefully to his front leg, his tail managing a weak but genuine thump the moment Walter walked through the door. "Hey, buddy," Walter said softly, sitting on a stool beside the table, resting his hand on Ranger's side, feeling the steady, if labored, rhythm of the old dog's heart beneath his palm. "You scared the hell out of me. Don't do that again, you hear me? We just found each other. You don't get to leave yet. Not for a long while." Ranger's dark eyes stayed fixed on his, patient and unafraid. The same steady gaze that had once guided 11 men safely past a hidden explosive in a country neither of them would ever be allowed to name, and something in that gaze seemed to say, as clearly as any words could have, that he had no intention of going anywhere until Walter told him it was time. The days that followed the diagnosis settled into a new, careful rhythm neither of them had asked for, but both somehow adapted to. Dr. Osei prescribed a small daily regimen of heart medication, tucked each morning into a spoonful of peanut butter that Ranger accepted eagerly, despite everything else changing around him, and a modified exercise routine that traded their usual brisk evening loop for something gentler, shorter distances, more frequent rests. Walter learning to read the subtle signs of fatigue in the old dog's gait, the way he'd once learned to read danger in a darkened doorway. You've got to let him rest when he wants to rest. Dr. Osei told Walter during a follow-up visit 2 weeks later, watching him hover anxiously beside the exam table while she checked Ranger's heart rate. I know that's hard for you. I know what this dog represents. But smothering him with worry isn't going to add years to his life. Letting him live the ones he's got, comfortably, is. Walter took the advice seriously. Though it cost him something every single day to sit still and watch Ranger nap through an entire afternoon, instead of following him around the yard the way he wanted to. He started keeping a small notebook on the kitchen counter, tracking Ranger's appetite, his energy, the length of their walks, a habit that Emily gently teased him about during one of her visits. You know you don't have to log every meal like he's a patient in intensive care, she said, flipping through the notebook's careful handwriting while Ranger dozed by the fireplace. I know, Walter admitted. But I lost him once already, without any warning at all. I think some part of me believes if I just pay close enough attention, I'll never be blindsided like that again. Doesn't matter that the logic doesn't really hold up. It's the only thing that makes the fear feel manageable. Emily set the notebook down and crossed the room to sit beside her father on the couch, resting her head briefly against his shoulder the way she used to as a little girl watching television on Sunday mornings. For what it's worth, I think that's a very you way of loving something. Careful, watchful, a little bit stubborn about it. Your mother used to call it hovering, Walter said, a faint smile crossing his face for the first time since the vet visit. She wasn't wrong, Emily said, laughing softly. But I don't think it's a bad thing this time. I think he probably likes being hovered over, honestly. Look at him, Ranger, as if on cue, let out a long, contented sigh in his sleep. One paw twitching gently against the floor, and Walter felt something in his chest loosen just slightly, the tight grip of fear easing, if only for that one quiet afternoon. There was a harder moment. 3 weeks after the initial diagnosis, when Ranger's appetite dropped sharply over the course of 2 days, and Walter, gripped by a fear he hadn't fully processed since the ridge itself, rushed him back to the clinic, convinced the worst had finally arrived. Dr. Osei ran a full round of tests, her expression carefully unreadable the entire time Walter paced the waiting room, phone gripped so tightly in his hand that his knuckles had gone white. It's not his heart, she finally told him, emerging with a cautious but genuine smile. Dental issue. Cracked molar, probably been bothering him for a while, and just reached a point where eating became uncomfortably enough that he stopped trying. We'll get it pulled this week. And he should bounce right back. The relief that flooded through Walter in that moment was so total, it nearly buckled his knees, and he had to sit down hard in one of the clinic's plastic chairs, pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes for a long moment before he trusted his voice enough to thank her. I know it probably sounds foolish, Walter said later that evening, sitting on the porch with Ranger's head, freshly recovered, freshly fed, tail wagging weakly but genuinely, resting against his knee, getting that scared over a tooth. But I think some part of me is always going to brace for the worst with you now. I already lost you once without getting to say goodbye. I don't think that fear ever fully goes away, even on the easy days. Maybe it's not supposed to go away, Colonel Hale said gently, having stopped by that evening with a bag of takeout neither of them had touched yet, still sitting untouched on the porch railing. Maybe that fear is just the shape love takes once you've already survived losing something once. I don't think that makes you foolish, Walter. I think it makes you a man who finally understands what he's got. Walter didn't answer right away, simply running his hand slowly along Ranger's graying muzzle, feeling the steady warmth of him, the solid, undeniable fact of his presence after 11 years of not knowing whether he was even still alive. "I'll take that trade," Walter said finally. "Fear like this, in exchange for however many good days we've still got coming. Seems like the better deal, considering the alternative I lived with for over a decade." Emily drove up from Ohio the following weekend the moment she heard. Sitting with her father in the small living room of his rented house, while Ranger recovered on a dog bed by the fireplace, his breathing steadier now, his appetite slowly returning. "You know," Emily said, watching her father gently adjust the blanket over the old dog's back, "for what must have been the 5th time in an hour, I used to think loving somebody meant they'd never leave. Growing up without you around, I think I built this idea that love was supposed to be permanent and uncomplicated, like in the movies." "And now?" Walter asked. "Now I think love is choosing to stay close to something, even though you know. Eventually, it's going to hurt to lose it," Emily said. "That's what you're doing with him. That's what I'm trying to do with you. It's scarier than the movies made it look, but I think it's more real." Walter reached over and took his daughter's hand. Something he hadn't done since she was a child, small enough to hold his whole palm in her tiny fist. And for a long moment neither of them said anything else, simply sitting together in the quiet living room, watching an old dog breathe steady and slow by the fire, grateful, both of them, for every ordinary evening they'd once assumed they'd never get to share. In the months that followed, life in Millbrook settled into something Walter had never expected to have again, an ordinary rhythm, full of small, unremarkable joys that felt, to a man who had spent 11 years bracing for loss, almost unbearably precious. He kept his job at the school. He insisted on that, told the vice principal plainly that mopping floors had given him purpose during the years when he had nothing else, and he wasn't about to abandon it now that things were easier, but something had shifted. Students stopped by his equipment closet just to talk, some of them working through their own quiet struggles and finding, in Walter's steady, unhurried presence, someone who understood what it meant to carry something heavy, without always having words for it. A group of seniors started a small fund, entirely on their own initiative, to help cover Ranger's veterinary costs as he aged. The school board, moved by the story, created a modest scholarship in Ranger's name for students planning to enter military or veterinary service, awarding the first recipient, a quiet junior named Marcus, who'd spent that first assembly recording the whole thing on his phone. That spring, Colonel Hale stayed in touch, visiting most weekends, and slowly, carefully, connected Walter with a veterans support group 2 towns over. The kind of group Walter had avoided for over a decade, because sitting in a circle of strangers, talking about things he'd buried felt, for years, more dangerous than staying silent. "I'm not doing it for me," Walter told the colonel the first time he agreed to go. "I'm doing it because Ranger already showed me what happens when you stop hiding. Figured it was time I learned the same lesson twice." Danny Ruiz and 2 other former teammates started making the 4-hour drive to Millbrook, once a month, sometimes just to sit on Walter's porch with a case of beer and talk about nothing in particular, the easy, unspoken kind of nothing that only exists between men who have trusted each other with their lives. Emily visited every few weeks, and slowly, cautiously, Walter and Karen began rebuilding something that would never again be a marriage, but had become, unexpectedly, a real and steady friendship, anchored by their shared love for the daughter they'd raised together and the strange, winding path that had finally brought their small, broken family back into something resembling wholeness. And every evening, without fail, Walter and Ranger walked the same quiet loop around the edge of town, past the school. past the little diner where the owner had started leaving out a water bowl by the door without being asked, past the war memorial in the town square where Ranger, unprompted, would sit for exactly 1 minute in front of the names carved into the stone before continuing on, a small private ritual that Walter never fully understood, but never once questioned either. Nobody had trained him to do that. Nobody needed to, on a cool October evening, almost exactly 1 year after that first assembly. Walter sat on his porch steps, with Ranger's head heavy in his lap, watching the sun drop behind the tree line at the edge of his small backyard. The dog's muzzle had gone gray in places. Walter hadn't noticed until the porch light caught it just right, and his eyes, though still sharp, had slowed with age in a way that made every quiet evening like this one feel a little more precious than the last. "You know," Walter said softly, running his hand along the old scar on Ranger's shoulder, a mark from a mission neither of them would ever be allowed to fully discuss. "I spent 11 years thinking I lost the best part of myself over there. Turns out he was just waiting for me to stop hiding long enough to find him." Ranger let out a long, contented breath, the kind of sound that needs no translation, and pressed closer against the man who had once carried him through the worst night of both their lives, and who had at last let him carry something back in return. The porch light flickered on as the evening settled fully into dusk, and somewhere down the quiet street, a screen door creaked open as a neighbor called their own dog in for the night, an ordinary sound in an ordinary town that no longer felt ordinary at all to the two of them sitting on those porch steps. Emily called that same evening, as she did most Sundays now, and Walter answered on the second ring, propping the phone against his knee so he could keep his other hand resting on Ranger's back while they talked. She told him about a promotion at the clinic where she worked, about Marcus finally meeting her mother over dinner the week before, about small, ordinary things that Walter now understood more than he ever had before were the entire point of a life, not the medals, not the ceremonies, not even the viral video that had started all of it, but simply the accumulation of small Sunday phone calls between a father and daughter who had found their way back to each other. "You're quiet tonight," Emily said near the end of the call. "Everything okay?" "Everything's good," Walter said, and found for once that he meant it completely. "Just sitting on the porch with your friend here, thinking about how strange it is that a year ago I would have told you nothing was ever going to change. Now I've got a daughter who calls me every Sunday, a town full of people who wave at me by name, and a dog who apparently decided a long time ago that he wasn't done with me yet, whatever the paperwork said." "I don't think he was ever going to be done with you, Dad," Emily said. "Some things just don't work that way." After they hung up, Walter didn't go inside right away. Instead, he clipped Ranger's leash on. More habit than necessity these days, since the old dog rarely strayed far, and walked the short distance to the edge of town, to the small stone memorial in the square where names were carved in careful rows. The same memorial Ranger had insisted on visiting, unprompted, every single evening for a year now. It was fully dark by the time they reached it, the memorial lit only by a single low street lamp, and Walter crouched down beside the stone the way he had 100 times before, running his fingers slowly across the engraved names until he found the one he was looking for, added just that spring at the town's request, Aaron Cole, alongside a small brass plaque funded by donations from across the country once his story, and Rangers had reached people who never expected to feel so moved by a name they'd never known. "I think about you sometimes," Walter said quietly, the way he did most visits, not embarrassed anymore by the habit of talking to a stone. "About all of you, honestly, but especially you. since you're the one who didn't get the version of this story the rest of us did. Renee's doing okay, by the way. I don't know if that matters to say out loud, but I like to think it does. She comes up sometimes on the anniversary, brings flowers, sits right here a while. Ranger beside him lowered himself slowly to the ground and rested his chin against the cool stone base of the memorial, exactly the way he did every evening, his breathing slow and steady in the quiet dark. "He still remembers you too," Walter said. 11 years, and he still comes here every night like it's the first time. I used to think that was just a strange habit. I think now it might be the truest thing about him. He doesn't let go of anybody he's loved. Never has. I got lucky enough to be one of them. Wish you'd gotten the same ending I did, but I don't think that makes what you gave any less worth it. 10 more years with your family. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. To the people who got to keep you a little while longer because of what happened on that ridge. He stayed a few minutes longer, the way he always did, letting the quiet stretch out around them, the town settling into its ordinary Sunday evening stillness on every side, a porch light here, a television flickering blue, behind a curtained window there, the distant, comforting hum of a life continuing on, exactly as it should. Then, slowly, he rose, and Ranger rose with him, and together they turned back toward the small rented house at the edge of town that had somehow, over the course of one improbable year, become something Walter hadn't let himself believe in for over a decade, a home. Not just a place to disappear into, but a place worth coming back to, every single evening, with the dog who had refused to let him stay lost. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, Ranger's steady, unhurried pace matching Walter's own, and by the time the porch light came into view, warm and steady against the deepening dark, Walter felt the same quiet certainty settle over him that had been building all year, gathering weight with every ordinary Sunday, every porch evening, every small kindness, from a town that had chosen in the end to see him. He sat back down on the porch steps once they reached home, Ranger settling in beside him with a contented sigh, and looked out at the quiet street one more time before finally heading in for the night. "You know," Walter said softly, running his hand along the old scar on Ranger's shoulder, a mark from a mission neither of them would ever be allowed to fully discuss. "I spent 11 years thinking I lost the best part of myself over there. Turns out he was just waiting for me to stop hiding long enough to find him." Ranger let out a long, contented breath, the kind of sound that needs no translation, and pressed closer against the man who had once carried him through the worst night of both their lives, and who had at last let him carry something back in return, because some bonds, the story of Millbrook proved, don't fade with time or distance or 11 years of silence. They wait. Patiently, faithfully, they wait, right up until the moment they're finally allowed to come home. And sometimes, if a person is fortunate enough, that homecoming doesn't end when the ceremony does, when the cameras leave, when the viral video finally stops trending. Sometimes it just keeps unfolding, quietly, one ordinary Sunday phone call at a time, one porch evening at a time, one quiet visit to a stone in the town square at a time, for as many good years as a man and his dog are lucky enough to be given. Walter Combs stopped believing, a long time ago, that his story was worth telling. A dog who refused to heal taught an entire town otherwise, and on quiet evenings like this one, with the porch light glowing steady against the dark, and an old friend breathing easy beside him, Walter finally believed it too. If this story reminded you that loyalty never really fades, no matter how many years pass, consider leaving a like pass so more people can discover stories like Walter and Ranger's. Share this with someone who believes our veterans and the dogs who served beside them should never be forgotten. We believe every quiet hero deserves to be seen eventually. If stories of courage, service, and second chances matter to you, we'd be honored to have you with us here at K9 Heroes Uncovered. Has a dog ever recognized someone you loved in a way that gave you chills? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.